Hello, good afternoon from where I am. Good evening to you where you are. And I think some people are also with us in places where it is morning. So I am going to say good morning to those people as well. As some people may know, I am on the east coast of the United States where it's early afternoon. So it is good afternoon from me. And welcome to this webinar, and thank you for registering to be part of it. This is being hosted by Integrative Ruminations, and I am the founder and CEO of Integrative Ruminations. And at Integrative Ruminations, we have been doing what I think has been really great work. And lately, we've been trying to promote mental health awareness and also provide trainings to mental health practitioners around the world. Recently, in February, in fact, on February 7th, we had quite a successful conference in Nigeria. It was a mental health conference that was designed to provide practitioners with practical tools for their work. And today, we are going to be talking about a very important subject, which is high conflict relationships. So, and the goal is to present practical tools for high conflict relationships. I know that some people are just asking me how to join, and we did send out a few emails over the last few days, and I am not sure how many people have that problem of how to join, but it's exactly the time to start, so we are starting. So what you see on the screen are some of the courses that we are offering through Integrative Ruminations, because our next cohort of trainings will begin on April 18, which is just a few weeks from today. The links to join are in the email that we sent out in the last few days. So if you are already on, please feel free to share the links with your friends. So if you don't mind, wherever you are, just send the link to everybody, even people who did not register. Just send the link to them so that they can join us. This is actually only for 1 hour. So I am looking forward to making sure that we actually do finish in an hour. And so today we are streaming both on Facebook and also on YouTube. People have joined us from those places, and I welcome you all for joining us. And when we talk about high conflict relationships, it is important to think about so many things that may be related to that. And throughout the course of this presentation, we are going to be exploring some of those issues that come to mind when we talk about high conflict relationships and how to solve them. I would say that right now, I know that people have joined us from, of course, across the United States and from Nigeria, Ghana, the United Kingdom, Tanzania, and I don't know where else, but if I did not mention your country, please accept my apology. And you can just let us know where you're joining from, and so that I can mention you at some point later. And I hope that you are all doing well where you are, and that it's not really a very difficult day for you. So I am going to start by talking about what the agenda is for today. And it is my hope that you can actually see this screen that I'm sharing. If you cannot see the screen, please feel free to say that either on YouTube or on Facebook, wherever you're watching from. Please, I want to make sure that we are all engaged in this as a dialogue, which means that if you have any questions, please write them down. And I will see your questions, whether you write the questions on Facebook Live or you write the questions on YouTube. I'll see the questions and I'll be happy to answer them. As I have indicated, I want this to be interactive, so I will be very happy to answer as many questions as you may have. I do generally love to answer questions. Therefore, I look forward to really taking those questions. So this is the agenda that I expect that we'll be following today. The first thing that I want to do is to help us to understand what high conflict relationships are by discussing the dynamics of high conflict relationships and identifying the common patterns that we see in high conflict relationships. And also, we'll be talking about how to de-escalate high conflict in relationships and how to do that in real time without wasting too much time. And I'll also be talking about how to move from reactivity, because high conflict relationships are really generally defined by reactivity. Something happens and you react, sometimes without thinking. And I'm happy to see people writing where they have joined us from. And please continue to do that. Continue to write where you have joined us from. And so we'll also be talking about practical tools and also some exercises and the long-term strategies and the options for dealing with high conflict relationships. Let's see, I have just been told that the screen is only partially showing. Is it better now? Is it better? Can everyone see the screen right now? And I hope the answer is yes. So high conflict relationships are generally defined by frequent disagreements that do not really just present themselves as ordinary disagreements that anyone would have in regular situations. In high conflict relationships, the arguments are not only frequent, but they are intense. And let me see, let me see what's happening here, because I see that this is not really, it looks like the screen is not moving from one page to another. So I'll keep talking and then I'll come back and share the screen again. So they are really defined by the intensity and the frequency of the disagreements. because they're not regular conflicts. They're ones that are fraught with significant disagreements that are frequent, and they escalate rather quickly. Rather than reaching for a solution, they just escalate. They can go from 0 to 100 in just a few seconds. And they are always dominated by emotional reactivity. Somebody gets upset, and that anger just multiplies very quickly. And the conflicts that are involved in high conflict relationships are very often unresolved, and they follow that pattern, the pattern of unresolved conflicts. And also, they are frequently repeated. And the emotional reaction is frequent, and very often they are also fraught with communication breakdowns. And if you are listening to me right now, you probably know a relationship like that, whether it's with people that you're working with, or yourself, or someone that you know who is in a relationship. Most of us, or nearly every one of us, has had the experience of not, even if we have not been in a relationship like this, we know people who have. And that is the point. So there are many types of relationships, as we know. One of the things that I've decided to do here is really to try to point out the various kinds of relationships that we have in which high conflicts can actually be seen. Okay. Romantic relationships are the first that come to mind when we are talking about high conflict relationships. Even when we talk about relationships at all, the first thing that the mind goes to is a relationship between lovers. But that's not the only relationship that there is, and that's not the only relationship where high conflicts do occur. But in romantic relationships, high conflicts very often occur because expectations are misaligned. The partners have different expectations from the relationship. And very often, too, there are communication gaps because partners are not communicating in the same way, or there's a lack of understanding, or the communication is stressed in one way or another. And then there is also a high level of insecurity in many of these relationships that can lead to high conflict. But parent-child relationships are also very often um, relationships that have high conflict present. I decided to make these distinctions because I know that when we put out the word that we're going to be talking about high conflict relationships today, some people actually thought they did not need to participate or shouldn't participate because they're not in romantic relationships. But the reality is that even in parent-child relationships, especially these days in our very high-stressed societies and our very high-stressed world, parent-child relationships are also increasingly fraught with high conflict. It can be conflict over what career a child wants to get into, and the parents' disapproval of that career, the choices that a child is making that a parent doesn't want to accept, or a child who has decided to get into a relationship with someone that the parents do not approve of. These very often end up in high conflict. In other words, parent-child relationships can also be high conflict relationships. And of course, workplace relationships can also end up being high conflict, where In meetings, someone can say something, maybe the boss or somebody can make a comment that upsets someone else. And before you even know what is happening, there are very strong words flying across the table, and the high conflict develops. And or even at your workplace, you may have a colleague who exhibits passive aggressive behaviors, which, if you actually take a close look at the passive aggressive behaviors, they then really are in the realms of high conflict, or your responses to that person's passive aggressive behavior can throw the whole situation into one of high conflict. And friendships also, when one friend is jealous of another, when there is scorekeeping, that friend is attaining significant successes and I am not. And the jealousy that results from that, or even just the thoughts that result from that, then also throws that whole friendship into one of high conflict. What I am going to be doing today is focusing mainly on the romantic relationships, but I am going to emphasize right now that the tools that I am going to be providing are tools that you will find relevant for all kinds of relationships in which there is high conflict. And I am making this point because you will get to understand and you will see when I make them and you'll be able to relate to them. But ahead of this, in the last, I think it was about 2 days ago, I did send out a case scenario that we are going to go back to and take a look at before we are done in the next, within the next 45 minutes or so. But then there are also co-parenting relationships. In a case, for example, where the couple are no longer together and they have children between them. In many cases, high conflict, that relationship which used to be a marital relationship, that was just a regular marital relationship, becomes a high conflict relationship due to sometimes arguments over how the children are being raised, or how the person who is living with the children relates with a parent who is not living with the children. These are all things that produce high conflict relationships. Even in co-parenting relationships where the parents are no longer together. And sometimes it can be because of things that are held over from the relationship, from the marital relationship, so that even though they are no longer together, the parents are no longer together, the consequences of the issues that led to the dissolution of their relationship continue to play out. So what are the characteristics of a high conflict relationship? A high conflict relationship very often is volatile because the two people just can't get along. They just can't get along. They argue over everything, basically. And it's a problem. It's a big problem for that relationship. It is high conflict. Blame, constantly blaming the other partner or blaming each other. Emotional reactivity, something happens and instead of responding in a way that some people will call mature, but that's not the way that I'll label it. I'll say responding in a way that is emotionally regulated, the person blows up because of something that happened. And then there is contempt for the partner. I'll tell you as a psychotherapist that it is not very uncommon that even people who have been married for many years and are living together sometimes can't stand each other. one has contempt for the other, and they're just living together because they feel that that's the right thing to do. And sometimes they're living together because of the children. So they do have contempt for each other, and then there's finger pointing instead of accountability. Instead of holding themselves to account, something happens, and then there's quick blame for the other person instead of owning up to what one did to contribute to what happened. Which is why when I am meeting with couples, when there is a problem in the marriage, I frequently say to a couple, now you tell me what you did to contribute to the problem in the relationship. You explain to me your own contributions to the problem. Because very often it takes two to tango. And because it takes two to tango, it also means that it's not always one person who has caused the problems in a relationship. Of course, it is possible that one person can be completely innocent, but that's not always the case. So when I ask people, tell me your contributions to the problem, it is because I want people to actually take a close look at themselves and see if there is something that they're contributing. And in high conflict relationships, there's significant high finger pointing, and somebody doesn't want to own up to what happens. And sometimes both people feel victimized. And then there are recurring issues in a relationship. And also same arguments over and over that resurface. And as frequently as they resurface, so also is the level of intensity. The level of intensity rises each time each time the conflict resurfaces. And then there is dismissiveness, where one person does not feel that what the other person brings to the relationship is important enough to be acknowledged. And or the contributions of that person not only do not deserve to be acknowledged, but they also deserve no respect. There is mocking as well. Why is it that you have no money? Look at your mates. My friend's husband or my friend's wife has just done so and so, but you can't because you're just lazy. And that goes on and on and on and on. And then there's a shutdown that happens very often. It's one of the characteristics of a high conflict relationship. So that if you have clients, if you're in a relationship where you are shutting down instead of discussing the challenges in the relationship, you should really understand what I'm saying tonight, that that's one of the characteristics of a high conflict relationship. And so also is a relationship where there is no space between the couple. So between the parents and the children, there is no space to grow. People are just significantly enmeshed. Therefore, what happens to one person is considered as an injury to the other. Or one person cannot go out and get some fresh air because they are very enmeshed. And there is rigidity. There is no room. It's all black and white. What I say goes, and what I say is right. And that is rigidity, which is also one of the characteristics of a high conflict relationship. And by the way, I am monitoring our social media, or I should say, we're monitoring our social media, and feel free to ask your questions, and I'll answer them. And then there intense closeness that alternates with hostility or power struggles. Sometimes in a relationship where there is that enmeshment and there is rigidity and there is intense closeness, there also comes with that power struggle because nobody wants to give way to the other. So you cannot speak for me, even if I consider you the head of the family. Even if I consider you the mother of the children, you cannot speak for the children. You have absolutely no power. It gets to a point, as I said in my book on relationships, which is when loving creates difficulties in relationships. That kind of behavior and that kind of setting leads to a situation where, after a long period of anger and pain, the other person who is always relegated to the corner of shame becomes very angry, blows up, and then next thing is your relationship continues to live in a high conflict zone. So, why is this discussion important? It is important because high conflict relationships do impact mental health. They impact the mental health of the couple, or at least one of the couples, one of your colleagues or yourself at work, one of the children who is observing these high conflict relationships, or the child who is in a high conflict relationship with their parents, or the parents who are in high conflict relationships. Their mental health is frequently affected by this. And often they end up visiting a psychotherapist when they realize what the problem is. And it damages trust. If you're in a high conflict relationship, it becomes very difficult to trust your partner because you expect that your partner is going to always bring you stress. Because high conflict relationships are, even just by the way they sound, very stressful. And high conflict relationships, by their very nature, can affect your work, affect your family, and affect your social life. And what I want you to start doing, at least from this point until the end of this discussion, is to think back to the case scenario that I sent to you 2 days ago, and begin to identify there some of the common characteristics that you will see in that case that will let you know that this relationship is a high conflict relationship. In every high conflict relationship, there's a pursuer and there is one who withdraws. There is one who is pursuing, that is that person who wants a connection. And then there is the other one who is retreating. You will find that in every high conflict relationship. Sometimes they have had an argument, one person shuts down, but the other person is pursuing and wants that connection. So it is important that in your relationship, in the relationship of someone that you know, or the relationship of the clients that you're working with, to try to identify who the pursuer is and who it is that withdraws, especially because it's one of your responsibilities is to try to make sure that you rebuild the connection. And you are going to have to do that by bringing them from a place of retreat and a place of pursuit to the middle. And you cannot do that unless you know where the two people stand. And then there's, then we're talking about pursuit and withdrawal, and also there's criticism and defensiveness. One person is criticizing and the other one is defensive. You will see that in every high conflict relationship. So the way that I've described it here is that blame meets protection. The one who is defensive is trying to protect themselves and protect their emotions, and the one who is critical is blaming and is coming at you. So what that does is that it sort of brings up a fight or flight response. And sometimes it can be so intense that one person just freezes and there is no movement beyond that point. And then there is, again, there is score keeping and the assumption loops. where there is mind reading. I can tell I can tell that you're angry with me, but you said so and so, even though that partner did not say that. What you have just done is read their minds because you think you know that partner well enough to know what he or she is thinking. But what that does is it creates even more problems in the relationship. So the high conflict relationship even grows higher. And so there's reduced ability to think clearly, especially when you're in the middle of that high conflict. It is very difficult to think. And so you can just freeze. And then at the end of that, even when you think that when the other partner thinks that things have moved on, the partner who couldn't think clearly at the time of the conflict is ruminating about what happened and beating himself or herself up for not speaking when they should have spoken. And then the next thing that happens, they blow up and the high conflict resumes. So there's always reactivity. Reactivity replaces intention, so that instead of gradually going through a process in that relationship, it becomes one where there is constant reaction to what the other person is doing. So the common trait, let's look at the common triggers. What will trigger a conflict in a high conflict relationship? Feeling disrespected, miscommunication, unmet expectations, especially in situations where expectations are not clear. One partner doesn't know the expectations of the other person. Stress and external pressures, impulsivity, you don't think before you respond to the partner. And in many cases, in a very large number of the cases where there is high conflict, it is because the people are themselves not compatible. And then there is fear of rejection or abandonment. There is loss of control, and the loss of control actually incenses and pours petrol on the conflict when it begins. There is perceived criticism, even if the question or the comment that was made, the question that was asked or the comment that was made was not intended to be critical. The other partner perceives it as being critical, and they respond. It's a trigger for high conflict. And in many cases, too, high conflicts are produced by previous traumas that have not been resolved. I am going to try and go quickly because I gave this just 1 hour. We're probably going to go a little bit longer. But another thing that I can also do is to offer an opportunity to people who want to have further discussion of this to come to Facebook, and I can send you a Facebook link right after this, and we can have a Facebook discussion about this continuing. So this is how the high conflict relationships begin. In every high conflict relationship, you should look for, if you're a practitioner, or if you have a friend in a high conflict relationship, or if you are in a high conflict relationship, always think, what is the trigger? What triggered this conflict? What triggered the last conflict? What is the usual trigger for most of the conflicts that we have? Every high conflict begins with a trigger, followed by a reaction. The reaction is based on how I received that trigger and how I interpreted it. So the reaction is to that trigger. And then an escalation happens. That escalation kicks what was probably just a regular calm discussion into the realm of high conflict. And then there is the aftermath, where they don't speak to each other for 3 days, 2 days, 1 month, or they say, I'm just not going to talk to you anymore, and that's the end of our friendship. We can no longer be friends. Or I'm going to kick the child out of my house because the trigger led to a reaction that escalated what what had become just a little conflict, and the aftermath is the overall consequence. And so in high conflict relationships, and if you look at this diagram, I put a repeat in the middle, because in high conflict relationships, the conflict cycle is repeated over and over and over and over again. So that even if the aftermath is a resolution of the conflict, which is what happens in many cases, that the aftermath is the resolution of the conflict is resolved. Another trigger comes, another reaction happens, another escalation occurs, there's another aftermath, and then there's another trigger. It's a cycle. In high conflict relationships, that cycle begins, ends, starts again. It's often repeated. But why do they repeat? They repeat because for that relationship, that kind of cycle has become habitual. So the reactions that you see are habitual. Then there are unresolved past wounds. And I hope now you're thinking about the case scenario that I sent to you. There are unresolved past wounds. So that when something happens now, one partner brings up what happened 6 months ago and the comment that you made at that point, because it's a wound that still had not resolved. And so the behavioral patterns are thereby uh, repeated over and over again. And so there is sometimes to a desire for a win, because the last argument, my mind is saying to me that you won the last argument. So I have to win this one. So I'm not going to let this rest. I'm not going to let go because I want to win. And so relationships become, in that regard, competitive. And so, but I was a guest last night on a on a TikTok show where I was asked to discuss anger management. That TikTok show actually lasted for 2.5 hours. And one question that someone asked me was, are there some personality traits that you can link to anger? I answered that question, and then I said, it's interesting because it's something that I expect to discuss tomorrow, which is today. Because there are indeed high conflict personality traits for high conflict relationships. And if you think of this and everything I'm going to say about this, it becomes that much more important for you to think of the compatibility of the people in a relationship, whether it's the relationship between you and your colleague, the relationship between you and your friend, the relationship between you and your romantic partner. Compatibility becomes that much more important because of the personality traits. For people in high conflict relationships, there is always at least one person whose personality trait is prone to blaming others rather than being accountable, whose personality trait is so competitive that it's all or nothing for them. They have to win. It's all or nothing, or it's their way or the highway. Personality traits that are prone to have difficulty regulating their emotions. And we have, there's a clinical diagnosis for this. And so personality traits that are resistant to feedback because they are always right. They must always be right, and everyone else is always wrong and must always be wrong. And then there are highly reactive personalities, people who can't stop to think before they react to a situation. And if you're in a relationship with someone like that, or know someone who is, or you have a client who is, or you have a couple who are in a high conflict relationship, it is important to try to identify, using all of this, what personality traits they have that are prone to high conflict, because then you can help them address those issues. I'm not seeing any questions. It will be, so I'm just going to keep talking, but if any questions come up, I'll be happy to answer them. And so let's talk now about how we break the cycle. First is awareness, which is what we are talking about now. We can break that circle of high conflict, the cycle that goes from trigger to reaction to escalation to aftermath, that then repeats itself over and over again. The first tool that you need to have and that you need to equip your clients with, or your friends or family members or whoever you know, or yourself, is awareness. And in that awareness, there are 3 steps that I have identified. I could identify more, but the first is to make sure that you can pinpoint the triggers, be aware of the triggers, and notice the early warning signs, and then track the patterns of these conflicts. And also, the second tool is to learn how to pause. You don't have to jump, you don't have to react immediately. Things can always wait. You don't have to react immediately. So it is important to pause and regulate your emotions. That is, slow down before you respond. Take a time out. Encourage that. Encourage that. Encourage your clients. Encourage yourself. Practice that. Take a time out and use breathing techniques. One that I have found to be very effective with my clients is what is known as the 4-4-6 method, where the client inhales, and while they're inhaling, you want them to count in their minds. And you can practice this with me if you want. You inhale, find a quiet place, but you don't have to be in a quiet place. You can do that even on a bus. You can do that on the streets of Accra or Lagos that are very busy. You can do that on the streets of New York, the streets of London. Just you inhale, focusing on yourself and focusing on your breathing. You inhale and count 4 while you're doing that. You hold that for 4 seconds, and then you exhale for 6 seconds, and then you repeat for a few minutes. And one of the things that does is to bring you back to the moment. And also, I teach grounding techniques, which are part of mindfulness practices. You want to make sure that you are brought back to where you are standing. Are your feet planted on the ground? What do you see around you? Do you see a tree around you? Do you notice what is next to you right now? You want to ground yourself. Instead of responding right away, you want to take time to ground yourself. And also create space between the trigger and the reaction. That is what you do when you use these techniques. You're creating space between a trigger and a reaction. And so the third tool that I am going to be leaving you with is that of communication. The communication needs to be clear, very clear. Use I statements, what we call I statements, instead of blaming the person. Instead of saying, for example, You are so hurtful. You are just so hurtful. I don't know what God made you. All you do is hurt me. You are the most wicked person I know, and constantly blaming the person. Find a moment that is calm where you can have a conversation and say to the person, when you do so and so, I feel so and so. Don't, in this whole conversation, do not use the word you, because you then translates to blame. When you do so and so, I feel so and so. That does multiple things, including helping the person to understand exactly how their actions are affecting you. It also helps them to get some ownership of what is affecting you. Because you are speaking about yourself, you're not blaming them. Even if in the depths of your mind, you know they are wrong, what you want to do is put on the table your feelings. Be specific and be concise. So you may want to practice what you are going to say before you have that conversation. Because otherwise, if it's somebody who is very strong willed, you are going to get lost in the conversation. And after the conversation, you'll begin to blame yourself again. Express your needs very calmly. Avoid generalizing like you always do this. Listen, and what we call in a manner that we call active listening, which is where you are reflecting back to them what you're hearing. What I'm hearing you say is so and so. And then it gives you an opportunity to say, well, yes, to clarify exactly what you're saying so that the communication is clear, the message is clear, they get it, and you have expressed it very clearly. And because you have expressed it very clearly and they get it, it becomes easier for the change to be made. Distinguish between intent and the impact. Instead of saying, you always choose to hurt me, you say, when you speak like that, this is how it makes me feel. Instead of, your intention is to hurt me. That's your motivation. That's your intent, which then makes that person defensive and makes that person even angry because you're accusing them of something that it probably didn't mean. And you want to validate your emotions and the other person's emotions, even when you disagree. The other tool that I am going to be leaving you with is that encourages you, encourages all of us to set and maintain boundaries in our relationships, and also that we teach the people that we work with how to set boundaries and teach them about the importance of boundaries. That whole that can even be an entire subject for another webinar that we can have. But essentially, what you want to do in setting and maintaining boundaries is to define what is acceptable. And both of you can do that together. This is what is acceptable in our relationship. This is how we are going to interact with our extended families. This is how we are going to interact. This is how I would like us to interact with our friends. This is how I would like us to interact generally. Then communicate limits calmly and follow through consistently. And so I always teach my clients that the time to act is usually the best time to act is not when there is a big problem already at hand. The best time to act is really also when times are good. That is when you practice for the time when things are bad. And one way that you can do that is by scheduling check-ins, maintaining regular contact, regular discussions with your partner. You can schedule structured check-ins. You can on your way to work. That's not really scheduled, but it can become something that's expected. That becomes what you do on your way to work, on your way from work, when you're traveling. You call your partner. You let your partner know how you're doing. You let your friend know how you're doing. You let the colleague that you know at work uh, do know what you're doing, how you're doing. Regular check-ins, regular reflection. This your own regular reflection. Why do I disconnect when I am with this person? What is it that makes me feel disconnected from them? And also, we just practiced some one breathing technique. That is one also that you can always use. And so somebody just asked, what specific de-escalation techniques do you recommend for someone to use in the moment when a conversation is starting to spiral into high conflict? I will go through the summary of de-escalation tools that I have provided here. It's actually part of it. Part of this actually summarizes what we already discussed. Pause before responding. Lower your tone and pace. This you can do even when to that question, when the conversation has begun and is beginning to spiral into high conflict, you can lower your tone. As you lower your tone, it sends a signal to your partner that you don't want to engage in this conflict at such a high level. And if they shout and shout and shout, and your tone is lowered, you are responding. You have not shut down. You are responding, but your tone is much lower. I bet you that in most cases, that partner is going to realize that they are just not doing well for themselves and are going to begin to back down. Acknowledge the emotion, the anger of the person, for example, but not their behavior. Avoid trigger phrases. Trigger phrases, for example, you are always planning to hurt me. You can never allow peace to reign because you will always bring, when there is peace, you will always cause conflict. And avoid trigger phrases, but use simple, clear language. Set gentle boundaries. I see a question here: which boundary setting strategies work best for maintaining safety and emotional distance over time? And how do you communicate those boundaries without inflaming the other person? I'm going to write about that. I'm going to write, and thanks for that question. I'm going to write about that and send it. I'm going to put it in my blog for this week. For next week, it will be my blog article for next week because it is vast and we don't have enough time now to discuss that piece. It is extensive and I like to give a more robust discussion of it and give space when needed. And that's one of the ways, that's one of the boundaries that you can set. And that is one of the things that you can do before it gets to high conflict. This one, I'm going to give you an example, and it's one that I teach my clients. You and your partner can agree that when you are beginning to feel that this is rising to high conflict, you will institute this boundary. You will say, I need to take a break. I need a timeout. And you leave that space. The other partner, because it's an agreement that you already had. And in therapy sessions, we create these agreements. And so when they're at home, they practice it. So when they are in the throes of a high conflict situation, one partner says, I need to take a break right now. And they go away for a few minutes. And they go for 15 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, however amount of time they agree on. And the other person must not follow them, because if you follow them, at that point, you are violating their boundary space. So in that way, you are maintaining emotional distance, and it is one that works, to your question, it is one that works over time. You build up to that, you respect that, and next time you just know, but you need to let the other person know that you're taking your break, because otherwise that person thinks you're just walking away from them and they follow you, and it just escalates even more. First, there needs to be an agreement that that's a boundary that's created to protect you emotionally. And two, you will notify your partner before you take that time. And three, that partner must not follow, because you have informed them that that's what you're going to do. So they get that you're not trying to walk away from them. And so focus on the present issue without bringing up the past. Focus on what happened now that you're trying to resolve. And use reflective listening, which is the active listening that I talked about before. What I'm hearing you say in this conversation is so and so. And regulate your body, take your breaks, and there needs to be, for this is, I put this specifically for couples. Track, it's let's call it your homework for this week. If you're in a high conflict relationship, track your high conflict pattern this week and practice one de-escalation tool daily. Take one from this list and practice it daily throughout this week. And schedule a conversation to repair, not a conversation to raise the conflict, but a conversation to repair the situation. And then also, if this situation doesn't change, I strongly suggest that you schedule a therapy session. So now what I want to do is to go back to the case scenario that you received in the mail. Okay, so I have a question that says, can you share practical steps for transitioning from a reactive pattern to a structured communication routine, signaling cooling off? Okay, it takes a lot of practice. The first thing to do is you have to really know yourself, right? And you have to know your partner. The question, transitioning from a reactive pattern to a structured communication routine, again, it takes a lot of practice. And if it's one that you're going to do with your partner, it also takes contracting, having discussions and coming to an agreement as to how you are going to be handling these to make sure that you really are not always reactive. But one of the things that I think is also important is you and your partner should come to an agreement, write a list of what tends to trigger reactivity in your relationship. Write the triggers down. Identify the ways that you respond. Even if you're not doing this with your partner, you can do it alone. Identify the ways that you respond in situations like that. And then create. That's number two, right? Identify the triggers. Number two, identify how you respond. Number three, create a table, healthy, unhealthy. And there are ways that you respond that you already identified. Write, put the ones that you consider are healthy in the healthy column and the ones that are unhealthy in the unhealthy column. And then the ones that you want to change are the ones that are unhealthy. And the ones that you want to get better, but the other ones that are good, you want to do them better. And so you come back and say to yourself, these are the ones, these are the reactions that are not good, because these are the reactions that maintain the reactive pattern. So what I want to get to is this other part, which is a structured communication routine. That's where I want to get to. So how do I move from this point to that point? You practice the techniques. Mind you, this question is about reactivity. And what you want to change is how you react. I have already presented some techniques, but there are more techniques that I think you can also use to do that. One falls in the realm of what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, where you already know the triggers. You already know the how you respond that makes you behave the way that you do. But it's possible that you really have not consciously come to terms with that, or you have not consciously identified that. So if you look at that list, you say, these are the things that happen that make me do this. So why do I do this? Why do I react in this way? Okay, now going forward, I am going to think these actions will not change, but my reactions to them will change. The triggers will not change, but my reactions to them will change. So the way that I'm going to react is to step back before I respond. Before I react, I'm going to step back. But this is the technique that I'm going to use. And well, let's say in my blog article, I'm going to give you some of those techniques. But these are the techniques that I'm going to use to help me step back before reacting. And in that way, in following these steps, but remember, first of all, identify the triggers. Secondly, identify your reactions. And number three, identify the ones, create a table. One area, the reactions that are healthy, the other area, the reactions that are not healthy. Then you go into trying to change and trying to improve the good ones, but trying to change the ones that are maladaptive. And the way you change that is to say, between my understanding of what just happened, between the trigger and my reaction, that is where I need to intervene. And these are the techniques I need to put in place. And some of those techniques I'm going to send to you. They are mindfulness-based techniques, which will call you back. And some of them, they fall in the realm of what I just said, how your cognition, how your behavior responds to the cognitive interpretation of your environment. One said, another question is, for relationships that started without the knowledge, that is setting boundaries, pausing, where can they start from? You can start from just a conversation. If your partner is willing to have a conversation, and I'm sure they will be willing to have a conversation, they'll be willing to set time aside to have a conversation. If they're not willing to set time aside to have a conversation, you can do that at the dinner table. If you don't set a specific time, you can start identifying that table and say, for example, I realized that in our relationship, this is what's been going on. And I think it's because we never really had tools for addressing these issues. I am thinking so and so. How about so and so? But the way you present it must be non threatening. So it should really start. If it wasn't there in the beginning, it should start with a conversation. And then you together build practical steps for doing what I have been describing. And I know it's already 5 minutes past the time that we agreed on. You saw the case scenario and you saw the conflict pattern. If you look at that, I am going to ask, let's see, and well, if you look at uh, that case, there was a pursuer and then there was a withdrawer. There was one who was always raising issues and pushing for discussion. And then there was one who was always withdrawing and shutting down to avoid conflict. If you want to write down who the pursuer was, I'll be happy to see what you've written down. But I can just say that we saw in that case scenario that Ross was pursuing, was the one who always raised issues and was pushing for discussion, while Mark was the one who was withdrawing to avoid conflict. And if you remember what I said before, one thing that you want to do is to bring them to the middle where they can agree. And so we also noticed in that case scenario that that situation was escalating. Small issues quickly turned into global criticisms and a reminder of the history of their relationship. With Rose saying to him, "This is just like when you forgot my birthday dinner last year." What I just said before is to focus on the moment, otherwise it just escalates. And there was defensiveness and invalidation. Both partners feel unheard and misunderstood. There were significant boundary issues, with Mark feeling overwhelmed by constant confrontation and Rose feeling dismissed and abandoned. So these are the things that you want to identify in working with a couple or in the relationships between the people that you know, or in your own relationship if you're the one who is involved here. So you want to ask yourself the question, or ask them the question, what triggers the conflict between you? Or what triggers the conflict between my partner and myself? And describe the cycle of interaction. Remember, I also presented here a diagram that I said is a cycle of conflict. You can try to identify that with them or with yourself or with you and your partner. And then identify one example of criticism and one example of defensiveness and withdrawal. And reframe the interaction by teaching skills. And the intervention, you can get them to list 2 interventions, or you can list some interventions that you can use. At this point, I think I am going to let us all go. But what I am also going to do is to, as soon as we hang up, I will send out an email with a YouTube link, with a Facebook link. Anybody who wants to come to Facebook, let's say I will be willing to give an extra hour. If I'll send a Facebook link to everyone, check your email in the next 5 to 10 minutes. I'll send you a Facebook link and you can join me on Facebook and we can continue to have this conversation for another hour. I hope it has been a very good time for every one of you. And I want to wish you, those of you who can join us, that would be great. Those of you who are unable to join us, I will say thank you for joining now. And for the rest of you who can join us on Facebook, I'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you, everybody.